Please welcome to the stage director Tom Hooper and recent Golden Globe recipient, Mr. Colin Firth. Hi. Have a seat. Right then. Let's crack straight into it. Tom, for you, where did this project start? Where was the seed of this project for you?
The only reason I came to know about this story is because I happen to be half Australian, half English, living in London. My Australian mother, Meredith, was invited late 2007 by some Australian friends to make up a token Australian audience in a tiny London Fringe Theatre play reading of an unproduced, unrehearsed play called The King's Speech. Now, my mum has never been invited to a play reading in her entire life. She almost didn't go because it didn't exactly sound very promising. But thank God she did, because she came home, rang me up and said, "You're not going to believe this, but I think I might have found your next film." Wow. And the moral of the story is, listen to your mother.
Colin, massive congratulations on the weekend.
Thank you.
Great speech as well. You always do. You always give a great speech. Great acceptance speech. We hope we'll hear a lot of them over the next few months. For you, where did your involvement in the King's Speech begin? How did it begin?
It's a boring story, I'm afraid. Lots of stories were about Geoffrey Rush receiving a package on his doorstep and all that. I just got sent a script, and Tom said, "Do you want to do the film?" And I said, "Yes."
Simple as that.
I know, he really let the side down with the how did you get the film anecdote.
Yeah. No, I mean, Tom and I met, we had the statutory meeting, the let's talk about it, do you look like someone I want to work with sort of meeting, which I think we had scheduled for 1 o'clock, and we were still sitting there at 6. So it was basically, we just got to work that day. Yeah. And, we...
It's a film that has just... it's just captivated people. And do you think that's because at the heart of it's a story about friendship? It's a story about, I guess, unpredictable friendship, I guess.
I think it's about a lot of things. I mean, I think it's about this. I mean, we live in a very a world that's quite selfish. I mean, it's all we're told to improve ourselves. We have to look into ourselves. We have to dig into ourselves. It's very much the me generation, and this story is about how sometimes to find your best self, you have to open yourself up to others, and in this case, it's about opening up to a friend, and so in some ways, it's about finding greatness through the power of collaboration. And as a director, I feel that very strongly because I stand on the shoulders of many talented people, and you are only good as a director through and in collaboration. So in some ways, it's a sort of love letter to the power of collaboration.
I also think there's something that's. I'm only reflecting on this now because I'm so startled by the reaction. There's something about language that I think is probably applicable to everybody, and that it resonates with everybody. If you take away language and the ability to use it as efficiently as your brain wants you to, then you take away something which I think is so basically and essentially human that it strips you of something very, very important. And I think that can be representative of all sorts of areas where people feel disempowered or helpless. To see a man stand up in front of a vast crowd and broadcasting to an even bigger one and not be able to get a word out plays into anxiety dreams which all sorts of people have.
Yeah.
Dream you might have as a child when the monster's after you and you can't run because you can't use your legs, or you can't scream because you can't use your voice. And those are all, I think those all represent, things with very, very basic things that we use to defend ourselves or to express ourselves. And to present a man who has that problem, it doesn't just apply to people who struggle with speech. It applies to people who struggle to communicate in all sorts of other ways as well.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. I hadn't thought about the fact that it's true that one of the regular frustration dreams, nightmare dreams, is either not being able to move fast enough or not being able to talk, not being able to scream out, not being able to articulate. And I think we all have that in common.
You mentioned that scene. We're going to take a quick look at it's the opening of the film pretty much, which sort of sets the start of the tale. just egging him on as you're watching it. You sort of feel the tension as a viewer of the film. You just want him to get the words out.
Couldn't have gone on much longer, could it?
But for you as an actor, it's almost the opposite of your job in a way, in terms of, as an actor you have to get the performance and the words out. I mean, was this a bigger challenge for you in terms of the delivery of it, in terms of playing a man who had this speech impediment?
Yes, I mean, there were technical things that I had to learn that didn't apply to everything I do. But funnily enough, it's as much about what you can't say as what you can. I think good writing is like that too. Good writing never perfectly expresses something by doing it directly in a linear fashion. The way we, the writers we admire most are reaching us by oblique means a lot of the time. Shakespeare does it. Tennessee Williams does it. People talk round things. They don't say quite what they want to. Empty spaces, the use of silence is incredibly powerful. I mean, Pinter and his pauses and his silences are extremely eloquent. So I think we do deal in the business of silence and what words... in other words, the eloquence of words in being inadequate.
Yeah.
Great writing does that. So it's not about, the perfect acting job wouldn't be one where everything's necessarily fluent and fluid and perfect. Having said that, this is to do with stuff that arrives as a physical, possibly neurological block, and I had to try to explore that as best I could, and that's unique to something like this, definitely.
You mentioned the writing as well, but I was watching an interview with you, Tom, where you said that Colin kind of added his little bits in the script as it was going along, because that friendship between Lionel and His Highness develops and stuff. There was one that we saw in the trailer where he says, "Do you know any jokes?" And was that an ad lib? Is that?
It wasn't an ad lib, but it was definitely a line.
That was definitely a Colin Firthism.
Well, that was because, it wasn't a willful changing of a line, just so we could find something funny to say. The original line was, because we found out different bits of research detail as we went along. And we've still got people at us saying, they'd never say nice to meet you and all that sort of thing. And, everyone's got a view on...
Everyone has an opinion.
Exactly. But apparently, the expert that we had on the set did say... The original line was when Geoffrey says the royals don't joke. When he says, "Do you know any jokes?" My response was, "Royals don't joke." And we were told royals never refer to themselves as royals. So we had to look for a different line at that point. And I just thought, well, jokes, how long have you got if you want to hear me tell a joke? And so that's where timing's not my strong suit came from. And also I think these men use humour as a means of sparring, as a defence.
And the interesting thing is that the script we started with had did have tremendous wit in it, and it was very exciting because about 9 weeks before the shoot, we discovered that Lionel Logue, the speech therapist's grandson, actually lived in London 10 minutes from where I live, and in his attic he had a filing cabinet, and in that filing cabinet was a set of papers, amongst which was a handwritten diary account of the relationship between his grandfather Lionel Logue and the king, which no one knew existed, no historian has ever read, no member of the royal family has ever seen, and we got it in our hands 9 weeks out, this sort of treasure trove of information. A few of the best lines in the script actually come from the diaries, and a very good example is at the end of the big speech at the end of the movie, for those who've seen it, Lionel turns to the king and says, "You still stammered on the W," and the king says, "Well, I had to throw in a few so they knew it was me." That line without fail gets a laugh every screening I've been to. It was actually said out loud last by the real King George and the real Lionel Logue. But why is it important? It's not just important because it's a lovely line. It shows that there was tremendous wit in the relationship between these two men, and David Sider, the writer's hunch that it was key, was absolutely right. And some of the historians, particularly nearer the time to King George, were a bit tough on him. They saw the stammer as evidence of mental weakness, of a slow brain. I mean, they couldn't look beyond the stammer, and it was wonderful having this first-hand primary source evidence of his wit and his intelligence.
When I first went to see the film, it wasn't what I expected in terms of the tone of the film. I didn't expect it to be funny, but we were laughing out loud. There's a wonderful tone to the film as well, which you know, you say it wasn't just a line I threw in, but it felt right. It felt like it matched the relationship between these two men. What an amazing thing to come across these diaries. Did you weep?
Yes, I also wept trying to decipher Lionel Logue's handwriting. And weirdly, the only person who could decipher it was my mum, whose handwriting is even worse. But I mean, the other great clue that it gave me, which is incredibly important, is in the script that I started with. David imagined that when he made the final speech on the outbreak of war, it was in a big room and everyone was there. You know, all the politicians, the royal family, Lionel. And then it was only from the diary that we discovered he did it in a special private back room, which Logue had decorated carefully just for the king, and it was one-on-one. And that gave me the clue that maybe the key to the movie was having Logue in the room with him. And you know, obviously, if you're making a film about speech therapy, as a director, you're starting by saying, where is the epiphany? Where is that moment in therapy where he's unlocked and he's fine? And I began to realise that it possibly wasn't a therapeutic epiphany. It was perhaps because he had this friend in the room that he was able to make that speech. And my theory about the movie became someone saved by friendship rather than saved just by the therapy.
And in fact, I think it's another example of the eloquence of silence. You know, silence can take on so many different forms. You know, for the character of Bertie, obviously silence is hellish. It's a complete inescapable abyss. It's something you can't climb out of. But that scene, with barely a word from Lionel Logue, it was written without him present, wasn't it? Wasn't he in a different... Yeah.
He almost orchestrates.
Well, it becomes a dialogue. Yeah. It is like he's conducting it. But it, without a word from him, it is a dialogue between two men, you know. And... you know, with me doing all the talking, and, you know, but it's a completely comprehensive interaction.
Even with him mouthing obscenities at you in the middle of it.
Exactly.
And it also sort of reminds me a lot about that scene is a lot to me about directing and what it's like to get a performance from an actor, because there's a moment in it when Logue stops directing, he stops conducting, he stops mouthing, he stops the dialogue, and his arms fall to his sides, and he's struck by the magnificence of the performance, and suddenly he becomes not a director but an audience member. And that is what happens when you work, and when I work with the greatest actors, is with however much you rehearse and however much, when I'm watching Colin and I'm analysing what he's doing, there always is that moment on set when you're suddenly thrown into being an audience member, and you're knocked out by what the actor's doing, and your critical mind is completely shut down by the brilliance of what he's doing. And let's just say on this film this happened quite a few times with Mr. Colin Firth.
Oh. Well, let's talk about your other cast members as well, because what an incredible cast. You know, not just yourself and Helena as well. A wonderful queen to have next to you. We've got a great clip of her right here. Her first meeting with Logue. She's just incredible. I love her. I absolutely love her. It must have been a joy to work with her.
It was. I mean, when you're working with these two, you take a free ride on their talent, really. I mean, you get an awful lot of credit for really basically what other people have given you. And also what reads in an audience's mind. I mean, there she is, they're playing off each other's extraordinary energy and dexterity. But the first scene you see of the Wembley speech, part of the reason why I think that has an impact is it's not so much to do with what I'm doing, it's what plays on her face. You know, I think people it hits them here when they see how helpless and devastated she is. Yeah. And so I think people often don't know necessarily to make a tally of who's responsible for the impact that they're feeling. But, you know, it's not, you know, this is very, very much the essence of collaboration, I think, is you see that banter between those two.
Yeah.
And that's where the whole dynamic, that's why it's funny, that's why we laugh, and, you know, this sense of the unexpected all the time. But they're both just as mentally agile as each other as actors, which meant that we were perpetually or I was perpetually on point, you know.
And it was certainly for me, I mean, I fell in love with Helena as an actress in Room with a View and as a teenager, and I think she's a formidable classical actress, and she's been playing some quite eccentric roles, and I was pleased to give her this part which was sort of tapped into that brilliant sort of classical ability she has. But I mean, as a teenager, I used to have a poster with Helena Bonham Carter on it. But the only thing is, I had to admit to Helena that the picture of the Panavision film camera above her was far larger than her. She was that size, and the film camera was about this size.
What about in terms of, for you as a director then, when your mum brings you this project and you start thinking about this one and that one, and do you have in your head of who you see in these roles as you're going through? Do you?
Yes, I mean, it was interesting with casting Colin. I mean, the only anxiety I had was the fact that Colin doesn't look exactly like the real king. I mean, the real king is small and slight, and Colin is a strapping lad of 6'3", and after working with Tom Ford, let's just say he was looking a little buff. And but I felt in the end, I don't want to embarrass Colin, but I from my research, King George VI is nice to his core. He has a tremendous moral compass. He has humility, and he's a gentle man. And those are all ways I would describe Colin. I mean, Colin, to me, is nice to his core. He has a great moral compass. He's tremendously humble, and he's a gentle man. And I felt those connections were more important. And also, most importantly, if you're going to make a film which is all about a man stammering, if you don't care for him, it's very, very difficult. And I do think Colin's genius in this movie is he leads us to love his character, to care for his character, without soliciting that sympathy through ever over-emotionalising, through ever being self-pitying, through ever appearing to chase after that sympathy. And he maintains at all times this extraordinarily deep and profound reserve that the man had, and I think that's his brilliance.
Is it a help for you, Colin, as an actor, when you have? I mean, there are recordings of these speeches, of his public addresses. Does that help you, or does it?
No, it helps.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll do two things. It puts pressure on you as well, but it's source material. What really did help me was that I had access to that stuff. But this is not, burned into the memory of every child. Yeah. In the way that, say, Churchill's speeches might be. I mean, the pressure on a person who's going to play a character as recognizable as Churchill or Hitler or Roosevelt, the people that are remembered and whose speeches ring in our ears. Whether people can go and check up on it afterwards is another thing. I wasn't really interfering with things that people of my generation, at least, had grown up cherishing. So I had a bit of room to manoeuvre. And I think you have to have room to manoeuvre if you're going to make a three-dimensional job of it, because it really does have to be yours, and you cannot be a slave to an impersonation. So I was much more interested in what it told me about what it was like to be him than just how it was going to help me mimic something.
Yeah.
The rhythms that he used in his speeches were clearly a way he had of managing the stammer. And I could hear codified in that courage, patience, resolution. Those are character traits which I looked for. And I think they're very clear. When he does hit a block, it was what it told me about how he navigates that was interesting to me. And there's a tightness to his expression. It's not just the stammer. I think it's how he grew up. It's the world he grew up in. It's his generation. It's his class. It's all that sort of thing. And we had a dialect coach because we had to be taught how to speak English in the way that they spoke English then, because we don't talk like that anymore. We might think we do, but it's changed. And that speaks of that tightness as well. This sort of terribly, it speaks of repression. It speaks of authoritarianism. It speaks of duty and all those sort of values.
Makes sense then. There's referred to as stiff upper lip, isn't it, in a way, doesn't it?
It's almost literally a stiff upper and lower lip and jaw.
Was it a challenge? Did you find it a challenge, or was it I imagine it was an enjoyable experience, but combination of it being a real person that you were playing with this speech impediment. Did you find that a challenge, or did you relish in it?
Well, it's both. I didn't want to. You don't want to be confined, but also it is quite nice to have a guidance of that sort. You're not going to get because we're dealing with a recent member of the royal family. you're not going to get a lot of personal help. You know, the palace are not in the business of, you know, saying, well, hang around with us for a few days and we'll show you how it's all done. And outside, you know,
it'd be great, wouldn't it?
It would be. I mean,
surely you've got invites to Kate and William's wedding now.
I think that'll tell us a lot, whether we do.
No, nothing yet.
I keep checking my post every day.
Yeah, every day.
You know, but so, you know, I could, unlike, you know, if I'm playing a cab driver, you could drive a cab for a few days or something, but they didn't give me control of the country. So but then you do have a lot of secondary material because this is someone that people write books about and someone that was recorded. And Tom and I came across a piece of film of something which echoes that first scene in some ways. It was another Empire exhibition, wasn't it, in Glasgow?
Glasgow, 1938.
1938, and this is post-help from Logue.
Yeah.
And you see him hit one of those blocks. It's not quite as devastatingly paralysed as what you see in the film there, but it definitely has something of that. And we both found it utterly heartbreaking to watch. I mean, there was the vulnerability, because when you're in that moment and language is taken from you, as I was saying earlier, it's that fundamental protection, that human faculty. This is what we use to defend ourselves to a great extent. And suddenly you're like an infant who doesn't have language, and all you can have is these noises that come out of your throat. And you see his jaw going, you see his mouth going as he attempts to come through it. And you also see that sense of absolute determination and that very humble sense of having no choice but to get on with it. And all of those things were very much on display as we watched that piece of footage.
At the time, you know, the nation had sympathy for him in terms of, you know, this issue that you had, which they wouldn't have now, would they, in terms of if it was someone in that position where...
I don't know. I mean, one of the extraordinary things I read these accounts during the Second World War, that the fact that the king stammered was something that everyone knew, and it made listening to him on the radio highly suspenseful for the nation, and his continued ability to overcome it and get through it without failure became a kind of metaphor for the war effort, and you know, it was almost as if the king can keep getting through his speeches without stammering, then plucky little Britain can prevail against Hitler, and it kind of became talismanic, and his struggle actually became hardwired to their struggle metaphorically, which is very fascinating, but also I think he did a huge amount to humanise the monarchy, because if the man speaking to you and saying, I share your suffering during the war, I understand what you're going through, is not speaking from some ivory tower or some gilded palace, but is staying in London throughout the war and the Blitz, and the act of speaking to you involves tremendous suffering for him. To even just do a wireless broadcast involves suffering. Him connecting with your suffering has an authenticity that it might not from someone else, and I do think it's one of the reasons why we remember him so fondly.
Also, I think because he didn't want power, when he delivers a speech denouncing what he calls the primitive doctrine that might is right, you can believe him. You know, this isn't a man who clawed his way to the top and then denounced someone else for clawing his way to the top. You know, I mean, if he denounces Hitler, and you're hearing it from a man that would do anything on earth to keep out of the limelight and not to get the top job. And he's representing those values against a man who is prepared to commit mass murder and invade Poland and half the rest of the world in order to get power. Yeah. Then you actually have got those values set in very stark opposition.
Yeah. Is it right that David...
Seidler.
Yeah. Did he approach the Queen Mother?
The story of filmmakers often talk about how long a film has been going. The story of this film really does go back, because David Seidler, the writer, was a very small boy during the Second World War, and he used to listen to King George VI on the radio, and his parents used to say, David, if the King of England can cope, there's hope for you. And so for David, King George VI was his boyhood hero, his inspiration, his kind of guiding light. And when he became a writer, his dream was to write about King George VI, and I think he made his first attempt as a university student. But it was only after David wrote Tucker for Francis Ford Coppola that he now felt, Hollywood is ready for the story of King George VI, rather naively thinking that was the way Hollywood worked. and he began to research it and track down Valentine Logue, the middle son who we see in the movie. And Valentine said, "Oh yes, I've got some of my father's papers, but you have to check with the palace." So he wrote to the Queen Mother, and the Queen Mother wrote back saying, "Please, not in my lifetime. The memories of these events are still too painful." And so David waited, little realising the Queen Mother was going to live to 186.
How amazing to get a letter back from her, though.
It is, and she wrote back. I mean, I would have been, 3 if she'd said yes.
Yes, that's a very selfish way of looking at it.
I've got a question. We're going to throw some questions out to the audience. This huge audience here. I'm going to start off with someone on Facebook. There's been loads of questions coming in. I'm just going to check I haven't already asked you it. Stephen Bowman, no relation, I promise. He said, is it different, harder playing the role of a king over playing a normal person?
I think it is in a way, because I can only stretch my imagination so far to know what that's like. And as I said, there's no real research you can do. I mean, if you're going to have to play a king, then to play this king, there is a way in, because he didn't think he was going to be king. So, although he was brought up in that family, and again, I don't know, I can only imagine that. I think it must be much harder to get into the mentality of someone who was born to it, because you can imagine taking on a job. That's not a job. It really is something that you've lived with all your life, and to immerse yourself in the idea that I've been born for this all my life. I don't know how far you can really get there. So, I still felt, however much immersion we attempted, and we did, I think, achieve it to quite an extent. I mean, the suspension of disbelief, I think, became quite comprehensive by the end. There was something about walking down a corridor and have absolutely everybody do that and bow, and everybody behave in an utterly peculiar fashion around you all the time, and nobody to be able to talk to you without calling you Your Royal Highness or Your Majesty, or and nobody being able to shake hands with you unless you offer your hand, and being accompanied by butlers and valets and equerries, and you can imagine it up to a point, but I still have my doubts as to whether I really know what that world must be like.
It's because you haven't spent that much time in Hollywood.
It's funny.
Don't change.
People have asked if being well known is the equivalent. It's not. People don't, just being a well known actor, people don't treat you with anything like the deference or respect that they do with members of the royal family. I was in the presence of a senior member of the royal family once for a film event, and it was interesting watching him being escorted around the room by his private secretary. And he was being apportioned a few minutes with this person, if that, few minutes with that person. And as he was talking, the private secretary was already eyeing the next person who was going to be chosen. And I was actually with my kind of Marxist anti-monarchy hippie friend, who was looking incredibly nonchalant and didn't know whether, do I really have to bow? Do I really have to shake? And as soon as he came over, it was all... His politics and his entire view of life went out of the window.
Let's have some questions from our lovely audience. A gentleman at the front. What's your name as well? Tell us your name.
My name's Paul Whiffin. I'm a fledgling filmmaker, so I really enjoyed, in particular, the way you shot the microphone in this film, because obviously you were helped a bit by the big old-fashioned microphones, but I loved the way that you actually made it look like a bomb, or it looked like a missile in some shots, and it's clearly intimidating the king enormously, or when he's when he's still not become king. But what I actually wanted to ask you about was the use of the Beethoven during the actual speech, because I think it's very interesting. I love the piece of music. I was very surprised to find it, being used in such a prominent way. Was it that dreadful thing where you used it for the temp track and you couldn't find anything else that worked as well?
I would say it's that wonderful thing that we use it, and I have to completely credit Tariq Anwar, my film editor, who, among other films, cut American Beauty. He cut The Madness of King George, rather appropriately. And the very first time Tariq showed me that sequence cut together, he'd chosen Beethoven's Seventh, and I thought it was a stroke of genius on his part. But he puts in huge thought into his music choices, and all the classical, the Mozart choices we've made as well are all come from him, and we never varied them. When Alexandre Desplat joined us, the French composer, I was totally ready for Alexandre to say, well, yes, it's okay, but let me have I'm sure I could do something better than Beethoven's Seventh. Amazingly, not only did he explained better than I had explained to myself why it worked, and his justification for keeping it was he said that Beethoven belongs to our public consciousness. All of us have some memory of that. Some of us know it very well. And it helps give the status of that speech the status of a public event, a public moment. Film score can never do that because film score is always original and internal to the piece. And by picking Beethoven, it elevates that event and makes it part of a broader world and a public world. And for him as a French composer, he said Beethoven was often was oddly enough one of the anthems of the French Resistance on French radio. They played the Seventh quite often, so there was also a particular connection for him.
Well, the microphone actually, I remember being kept waiting on a freezing damp set for, I think, best part of a day while Stanley Kubrick here waited for the right microphone to be sent, because he wasn't quite happy enough with the one that we had.
Yeah, but I mean, you're right. I felt this obsession with the microphone was terribly important because, it's all about the coming of the mass media revolution. I mean, we're sitting here, and this is, I think, being streamed, and it'll be podcast on iTunes, and this is the latest revolution. But the coming of radio, the coming of the ability of leaders to speak live to their entire public was an extraordinary revolution, and I wanted to capture the kind of status the microphone had in that new language. And so you're absolutely right. I loved that huge torpedo-shaped microphone that Edward VIII used in his abdication broadcast, and I used it at the beginning, and I photographed it with wide lenses, so it would feel like this sort of huge and scary object.
So in that opening scene, it's almost like he can hide behind it, but then it's got those little bits that he can still see the audience through that remind him that he has this public here. Another question, please. Lady, right there. Hello.
Hi. Just something very simple and fluffy. Has any member of the royal family seen this or got any contact from you?
Well, we still do not know if the Queen has watched The Queen. And if she has, what she thought. So the truth is, we may never know whether she watches the King's speech, but if any of you ever find out, please come and find me.
I imagine she's seen the Queen with microwave popcorn. I love the idea of that. She watched something in 3D recently at the royal premiere in Leicester Square. She sat there with her 3D glasses on. I saw that. It was an amazing thing to see. She looked wicked. She had a great time. Okay, girl. Sorry, I'm pointing out the most difficult ones for you to get to with a microphone. I'm sorry. Young girl in the centre. Tell us your name as well when you get the microphone.
Hi, my name is Maya Gustin. I don't know, obviously, what order you shot the scenes in, but when you finally were able to film that final scene, did you feel a moment of catharsis or relief when you, as the king, was able to, really finally get the words out?
I don't know. It was, that scene was somewhere in the middle of the shoot, so it certainly wasn't the end. It was certainly long before the first scene that you just saw. So no, because I knew I had to go back to the beginning again. And actually, it's a very odd thing we do as actors, because you have to try to do something and then try not to do it at the same time. So you have to acquire a problem you're trying not to have, and that's not just if it's stammering. It can be, if you're doing a story about an appalling marriage, or you're doing a story about being grief-stricken, or whatever. First you have to get there, and then you have to be the character who does everything in the story to try to get out of it. So, I had to learn to stammer in order to learn not to, because all you see is a man trying not to. And wonderful satisfaction in working with Geoffrey. That's what it was. I honestly felt, because it had become second nature to me to hit those blocks by then. I mean, it was almost an involuntary thing. It's bizarrely contagious. I mean, sometimes, he caught it as well. I mean, take him half an hour to get a note out sometimes. And so we were all walking around, with our fluency impaired. And we... in some ways, it was wonderful just to sort of connect with him and follow him. So that was a beautiful thing to be able to do. I don't know how long the speech times in our film, but very satisfying. But I also ended up with headaches, and so it's not exactly a freeing thing, because I was obviously doing something very odd. I mean, that scene particularly ended up with a strange sort of pinched nerve sensation in my left arm, which the nurse couldn't explain. But I think after doing several takes, I must have just been tensing my body in some peculiar way. Wow. And so I'd come away with this headache and this... do you remember me complaining about this numbness and not being able to use it? And I thought, am I stuck with it? What am I doing?
I think I said, yes, great, go again.
Yes, go. He loved sign of full immersion. He loved all that.
But my only memory of shooting the speech you're talking about is actually how brave Colin's choice was to still struggle with the stammer quite as much as he did even in the final speech, because he doesn't go into the kind of Hollywood mode of being absolutely perfect. And even I was worried whether we were not fluent enough, that we'd sit in the cutting room and wish that it had become more fluent, and actually it was a rare time. Normally I was insisting he stammered more, and it was a rare time when I worried he was stammering too much, but he was absolutely right in that instinct.
Yes, I don't think we've got any recordings of George VI or Duke of York that date from before he was having therapy.
Yeah.
I don't think they exist. We had somebody pull us up on this with this feeding frenzy of trying to find things that are inaccurate about the film. One of them was it was never that bad. Even before he met Logue, and I thought, well, could you produce us a recording to demonstrate that? Yeah. We don't know.
Quite handy, really.
I'm afraid this is the last question. Lady at the back. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Pernilla. I was wondering, which was your favourite scene to shoot, and which was your favourite scene to shoot, and were they the same, perhaps?
Shall I go first?
You go first.
Many.
I think I have to say, I think my favourite is probably the first day of the shoot, where we shot the first time the two men meet, which is a 10-12 minute scene, and it gives you some idea of the lowly budget of this film, that we had a day to shoot a 10-minute scene. And I wanted to shoot that meeting on the first day because I wanted some of the nerves and the awkwardness of the first day of a shoot to permeate into the nerves and the awkwardness of their first meeting. And not only that, I started with a close shot of Colin, which ran for the full 10 minutes, which I wanted the extra pressure of that choice to put him under such pressure that it would connect, hopefully, in my mind, with the performance pressure of stammering. And after this 3-week rehearsal period that we've had that was very intense, to see the two performances those men gave me on that day, and to know how anchored both of them were after the rehearsal in their parts, and it remains one of my favourite scene, because it was the moment where I realised that this chemistry was really going to work. And when if you look at that scene and imagine it the first day, it's quite extraordinary how inside the two men are.
Yes, I think I might echo that, actually. There's a scene where we first really went for it, because, it's quite intense stuff. And to try to do it in the context of film rehearsals, which aren't rehearsals in the same way that theatre rehearsals are. We're sitting around in front of coffee and biscuits, and to try to commit to the very dark place that this character goes to under that circumstance, in the bowels of a corporate hotel, And it wasn't really until the camera was actually rolling and there was that rather unforgiving lens right on me that I realised that, I was on. It was time to go. And so that it was quite exhilarating for us all, I think, to put our markers down and realise what we were committing to. And also, I have to say, I really did enjoy wearing the kilt.
Yes.
Might not
Being
be something
a Scot,
other people
I love
enjoyed.
that.
It was just, I wish I had an excuse to wear it in
I'm sure you could get another one.
Well, yeah, but
Now you've said that.
Not quite Scottish enough to really justify it, but it was.
If you go back far enough, I'm sure there's going to be
an experience of exquisite liberation, I have to say. No,
Are you trying to tell us you're being a true Scotsman?
I'm not trying to tell you anything. I'm glad I'm not sitting up here wearing it. Let's put it that way.
We want to see you in the kilt on your Harley then. That's the next thing.
The Harley. Yes.
Have you bought it yet?
No. I mean, unfortunately, I thought, Harley sounded good in the speech, but it's not. Ducati didn't sound quite as good, which is what that would be my genuine midlife crisis fantasy. Probably. Kilt in the Harley. Yeah, maybe that's the look we'll see next.
Watch this space. Huge congratulations on the BAFTA nominations as well. You must be just over the moon. I mean, did you ever, whilst you were filming this, did you think it would be a film that would connect this much? Not just with critics and things, but with an audience.
I totally believed in it when I first read the script. When it was a play script, I knew I wanted it to be my next film with complete unswerving faith. But the kind of success it's happening, I don't think you could ever predict. I was in a screening in Los Angeles on Saturday, and there was a woman there who'd come for the 10th time. I've had emails from people saying, my parents have only gone to cinema once in their life, and this is number 2. And we've had, standing ovations in cinemas with none of us present to do a Q&A. So it's gone into some other place, which I don't think it can ever be fully explained. But it's utterly thrilling. And also, we're here in the middle of London. This was a London-based shoot. It was a London-based crew. 90% of it was shot in London, and as a London filmmaker, it was fantastic to be. Most of it to be filming here, and most of it was filmed in Portland Place, which is a 5-minute walk from where we are right now.
Wow! Well, huge congratulations, February the 13th. Everything's crossed. Thank you so much, Tom and Colin.
Thank you.
Huge round of applause, please. Thank you, everyone.
All sorts of areas where people feel disempowered or helpless. To see a man stand up in front of a vast crowd and broadcasting to an even bigger one and not be able to get a word out plays into anxiety dreams, which all sorts of people have.
Yeah.
Dream you might have as a child when the monster's after you and you can't run because you can't use your legs, or you can't scream because you can't use your voice. And those are all, I think those all represent, things with very, very basic things that we use to defend ourselves or to express ourselves. And to present a man who has that problem, it doesn't just apply to people who struggle with speech. It applies to people who struggle to communicate in all sorts of other ways as well.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. I hadn't thought about the fact that it's true that one of the regular frustration dreams, nightmare dreams, is either not being able to move fast enough, or not being able to talk, not being able to scream out, not being able to articulate. And I think we all have that in common.
You mentioned that scene. We're going to take a quick look at it's the opening of the film, pretty much, which sort of sets the start of the tale. You're just egging him on as you're watching it. You sort of feel the tension as a viewer of the film. Please welcome to the stage director Tom Hooper and recent Golden Globe recipient, Mr. Colin Firth. Hi. Have a seat. Right then. Let's crack straight into it. Tom, for you, where did this project start? Where was the seed of this project for you?
The only reason I came to know about this story is because I happen to be half Australian, half English, living in London. My Australian mother, Meredith, was invited late 2007 by some Australian friends to make up a token Australian audience in a tiny London Fringe Theatre play reading of an unproduced, unrehearsed play called The King's Speech. Now, my mum has never been invited to a play reading in her entire life. She almost didn't go because it didn't exactly sound very promising. But thank God she did, because she came home, rang me up and said, "You're not going to believe this, but I think I might have found your next film." Wow. And the moral of the story is, listen to your mother.
Colin, massive congratulations on the weekend.
Thank you.
Great speech as well. You always do. You always give a great speech. great acceptance speech. We hope we'll hear a lot of them over the next few months. For you, where did your involvement in the King's speech begin? How did it begin?
It's a boring story, I'm afraid. Lots of stories were about Geoffrey Rush receiving a package on his doorstep and all that. I just got sent a script, and Tom said, "Do you want to do the film?" And I said, "Yes."
Simple as that.
I know, he really let the side down with the how did you get the film anecdote.
Yeah. No, I mean, Tom and I met, we had the statutory meeting, the let's talk about it, do you look like someone I want to work with sort of meeting, which I think we had scheduled for 1 o'clock, and we were still sitting there at 6. So it was basically, we just got to work that day. Yeah. And, we...
It's a film that has just... it's just captivated people. And do you think that's because at the heart of it's a story about friendship? It's a story about, I guess, unpredictable friendship, I guess.
I think it's about a lot of things. I mean, I think it's about this... I mean, we live in a very... a world that's quite selfish. I mean, it's all.
Want him to get the words.
Couldn't have gone on much longer, could it?
But for you as an actor, it's almost the opposite of your job in a way. In terms of, as an actor, you have to get the performance and the words out. I mean, was this a bigger challenge for you in terms of the delivery of it? In terms of playing a man who had this speech impediment.
Yes, I mean there were technical things that I had to learn that didn't apply to everything I do. But funnily enough, it's as much about what you can't say as what you can. I think good writing is like that too. Good writing never perfectly expresses something by doing it directly in a linear fashion. The way we, the writers we admire most are reaching us by oblique means a lot of the time. Shakespeare does it, Tennessee Williams does it. People talk round things. They don't say quite what they want to. Empty spaces, the use of silence is incredibly powerful. I mean, Pinter and his pauses and his silences are extremely...
We're told to improve ourselves, we have to look into ourselves, we have to dig into ourselves. It's very much the me generation, and this story is about how sometimes to find your best self, you have to open yourself up to others, and in this case, it's about opening up to a friend. And so, in some ways, it's about finding greatness through the power of collaboration. And as a director, I feel that very strongly because I stand on the shoulders of many talented people. And you are only good as a director through and in collaboration. So in some ways, it's a sort of love letter to the power of collaboration.
I also think there's something that's. I'm only reflecting on this now because I'm so startled by the reaction. There's something about language that I think is probably applicable to everybody, and that it resonates with everybody. If you take away language and the ability to use it. As efficiently as your brain wants you to, then you take away something which I think is so basically and essentially human that it strips you of something very, very important, and I think that can be representative